In this video, we'll go through the basic UV unwrapping options such as automatic, cylindrical, and planar. Now, if I just quickly click this cube here, we can see in the UV edit that it has its basic UV shell. It might look like one of those nets that you might have done in school, for instance, where you can kind of wrap it up into a cube. It's basically the same sort of thing here. Now, if I click on this particular uh, cuboid here, you can see that it has the exact same UV shell. Now, why is that? Well, the main reason is because when you create a 3D model, most of the time, as you may already know, you're creating them from basic 3D primitives, such as, say, a cube, sphere, pyramid, etc. And when you create a basic primitive, it automatically has a default UV shell, which is what we're seeing on screen right now, which is this one here. Now, as we edit our primitives around to shape them into whatever we want, such as, like, say, characters, weapons, etc., the UV editor doesn't update. It kind of keeps to its default, and you might see some extra sort of like mess of other faces that you may be adding or deleting throughout. But basically, it doesn't create its own UV shells. We have to create it ourselves. So at the moment, I have slightly edited the cube to make this much thinner. So we need to rearrange these UV shells into something more desirable, because as you can see right now, if I click this face here at the side, this doesn't really represent that face quite well, to be honest. As you can see, it is quite short and quite wide, whereas the actual face in the perspective view is quite tall and way thinner than this. So we need to use one of the UV unwrapping options. Now we can go to UV and go to planar. Now planar basically creates a UV shell based on the axes. Now you can see the axes in the bottom left hand corner here. We have Y, X and Z. Y being basically up and down, X being left and right, and Z usually meaning depth essentially. Sometimes it can be a bit confusing, but as you move around the scene you can see that the axes also move around as well, so you can always tell what axes you are in. So right now what we'll do is we'll select these two faces here, because these two faces are in the same axes, so we can just project from that particular axis. So it's saying here that we are projecting from the X. How can I tell? Well, what you should do is, when you select a face, have a look at the little icon in the bottom left hand corner, and you can pretty much determine, you can see that, okay, X is kind of going in sort of the left and right direction here. That's what I've got selected right now in terms of the faces. So yeah, it seems to be going in the X axis. And then from the planar mapping options here, we can change it from projecting from Y to, say, X. And all we got to do then is press project. And you see now it has created a whole new set of UV shells based off of the X axis. And we basically do the same for the rest of the object. So if I, example, go for these top and bottom ones right now, go back to UV, planar, change it from Y, then press apply. Because if I press apply, it will keep this box open here, as project will kind of close it down. And it has created a new set of UV shells based on these two faces in the Y axis. Now, as you can see right now, again, it's still not a great representation of these faces here, because again, it's much thinner and wider as well. So what we can do is, you might see these little icons here. You can see them in the perspective view. You can also see a 2D version of them here in the UV editor. This is basically the move and scale tool, so we can actually scale down our UV shells like we can do with any sort of 3D object. It's the same key buttons, W, E and R. So what we can do is we can do it here in the perspective view, or we can do it in the UV editor. I'll do it in the UV editor because it's quite easy. So for instance, I can click on the little green square here and just drag it down to make it a much better representation of that face there, and I think that kind of works at the moment. And I'll just move those two out of the way like so. And I'll just do the last two. And again, I will look at the little icon here, and these two faces are projecting in the z-axis, which is the depth, and press apply. And again, I can just quickly just thin these out, because again, I wanted to make it look exactly like the faces I have currently selected. And then we'll just quickly move them out of the way. Now, just to quickly go over the colouring, you might have noticed that, hang on, there's only 1, 2, 3 faces here, but this cube, or cuboid, is made up of about 6 faces. That's correct. What's happened is, you can see right now that it's a sort of like a purpley colour. That's because I am using the shaded UVs. So if I just quickly hover over these here, these icons change how I can see the UV shells. So if I just go to this right here, that's basically like the wireframe mode. And if I go to this icon here, it basically has a shaded version which helps me to see the UVs. Because again, if it's in the wireframe mode, it's hard to tell if you have overlapping UVs. If I go here, now at the moment it's purple. The reason why it's purple is because we have a few different UV shells overlaying one another. So for instance, if I click on this top one here and move it out of the way, you can see we have one blue UV shell and one red UV shell. And when they overlap, you'll see that it creates a kind of like a purplish colour. Now, there is a reason as to why these are red and that is blue. I'll explain that just a little bit later. But right now what we want to do is we want to change the colour to blue. So really quickly, if you go to transform and go to flip, you can make it blue. The reason why I'm making it blue right now is to show that if you have, say, 2 overlapping blue UV shells, you can see right now that it goes to like a darker shade of blue. So that way you know for a fact that you have 2 overlapping UVs. So you need to make sure that they're separate, like so. So for instance, I'm going to quickly move this out of the way. And I'll just quickly flip that one over. I'll keep this red for now just to explain what I'm doing next. So as you can see right now, we have this basic cuboid UV unwrapped. Now, we can't just have it floating around anywhere. We need to have this fit this particular section of the grid. Why? Well, because when we take a UV snapshot, we want to take a snapshot of what's in this particular grid setup right here. So we need to make sure that this is scaled down and fits within the parameters of this grid. So for instance, I'm just going to scale it down like so, and then just move these here. Oops. We don't want it to overlap. I'll explain why in a second. Okay, so now we have our UVs set up in the grid, which means that we can at some point export this out into Photoshop to then texture over it. But just really quickly, I'm going to explain as to why you shouldn't have any of your UV sets blue and how to make sure that the UV shells are sized appropriately. Now really quickly, right at the top here, you'll see that there's this little checkered box icon. And if I just click on it really quick, I'm getting a lot of emails right now. You can see that we're getting a checkered texture all the way around our objects, and we basically see it here on the screen as well. Now, why do you want a checkered texture around your object? Well, there's a few reasons for this. One is to see if the textures will be stretched and how much detail is going to be on the textures. Now, if you look at these squares right now, you can see that they are quite small and there's quite a lot of them on screen, and the squares are they're pretty decent shape, unlike say the ones at the top right now, which is much more like a rectangle. Now if I just click the UV shell for this face here, if I just scale it down like so, you can see that the squares get much larger. Now you may be wondering, okay, why is that important to know? Basically, depending on the size of your UV shell, it will determine how much detail or pretty much the resolution you're going to have on that particular shell. So for instance, the bigger the squares, the less detail is going to be, which makes sense because if I took a snapshot right now of this in say 4K, this UV shell right here, if I texture it, doesn't matter that the actual texture map is at 4K resolution, that face isn't going to get as much detail as say this one, because again it takes up more of the surface area. So the best way to remember it is the more squares on the UV shell, the higher the detail. So I can put, like, say, a really nice texture on this particular face right now, and it's going to look quite nice. And the reason why I want it larger is because, again, we have to look at the 3D object and think, okay, this face takes up a lot of surface area, so that would mean that the UV shell would also be quite large as well. So if we look at the red one at the side here, you may notice that there's some words here on the shell. That's because of the checkered texture here. It has a few little words just to make sure that the words are actually aligned in the right way. So you can see right now that 1 and V are actually flipped. They're not in the right orientation. When we flip the UV shells, you'll see that V and 1 are in the correct orientation. So essentially, if we were going to have some, say, graffiti on this wall here, if it was red, if the graffiti said hello, for instance, the word hello would be reversed if the UV shell was red. So it's always important to make sure that all your UV shells are blue. So make sure to just go to Tools, go to Transform, then Flip. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that all of our UV shells are in squares and not elongated like this as rectangles. Why? Because that means that the texture is going to be stretched. So if I put like a brick wall texture on this right now, the bricks would be very much stretched. So I need to make sure that they are all in squares, which may mean I have to kind of play around with the UV shells to make sure that they are like this instead. And if you're going to have a tileable texture around, you want to make sure that the squares, for instance, line up with, say, the ones on other UV shells, as well as being the same size. So for instance, these faces here are still way elongated, so I need to kind of play around with them to make sure that they have a appropriate shape. And I can just move it around slightly, just double check to see if it lines up. It lines up almost there. That would be kind of a good, that pretty much almost lines up exactly. But hopefully you get the idea that you're wanting to make sure that the squares are the same across the whole object, or as close to, essentially. And really quick, just to quickly showcase another type of UV unwrapping is with this cylinder here. We can use, say, planar mapping options, but it would take quite a while. So for instance, what I can do is I can just double click all these faces here, and under UV we have the cylindrical mapping options. There's no point going into the options because again all it is just this. Now if I just press cylindrical, it basically creates a UV shell all the way around those faces selected. So again, you can kind of see that it goes all the way around those particular faces. And this is perfect for something that's rounded like this, for instance. And then we can just scale it down, stretch it up, and again using the checkered textures to make sure that it is appropriate. So something like this, for instance, would be much better rather than, say, like that. And the last and final UV mapping options that you can use is, if I just quickly duplicate this cube right now, if I go to UV, we have the automatic options, and that basically creates automatic UV shells for you. So it's kind of like a quicker process than using planar mapping options. Now, automatic is okay for simple objects, but more complex stuff, it is highly recommended to use the planar and or cylindrical mapping options. Reason being is because automatic is not perfect in any way whatsoever. The best way to do it is by doing it manually. Automated can have some decent effects, but a lot of times it's not going to have your desired output. You might look at it and say, actually, a lot of this isn't really working out for me. It might create very small UV shells for certain parts of the object that you don't want necessarily. So a lot of times it is a judgment call. But I would personally say always use planar mapping options as opposed to the automated options. And that's a quick overview of the options that we have in Maya. So I would say to play around with the planar and cylindrical mapping options. In the next video, I will be going through mainly the UV editor and what options that we have here in the UV toolkit.